Welcome, everyone. Certainly from the number of folks in the audience and some of the reactions and questions that we got, thank you to those who filled out the Pulse survey in advance, because that's given us some good information of kind of the tone of the audience. Let's have a joke, right? Good to open with a joke. But the fact is, because of the outside influences today, thank you. Make sure I know how to work this. Not the least of which is shareholder activism, but the influence and power, shifting power of shareholders, but also things like cybersecurity, increased regulation and compliance. Boards are being asked to wear more hats than they have in the past. This is not only causing debate, obviously, about where the role of management versus the board actually begins and ends, but also the skill sets that are now required. We're going to get into that a little bit in terms of some of the questions of skills that are required now of boards versus even 5 years ago. All right, another joke, right? We could go through a lot of things today in terms of changing roles, not the least of which I mentioned those three, but what we're going to do is we're really going to take a deep dive into this issue of board shareholder communications. Obviously a little funny from this picture, but today the facts are that shareholders have an increasing appetite to actually get inside the boardroom, view the board as their agents, want to understand their process, want to understand why they came to the decisions they did. So these are the facts that we're seeing. Let's look a little bit at the factors, and we're going to go into some of these when we talk about activism, and obviously the three viewpoints that are represented here is board viewpoint, investor viewpoint, and company viewpoint. But if you look at some of the proxy access, everybody's familiar with this trend. There's a rise 8 times the number of proxy access proposals in the 2015 proxy season versus 2014. Say on pay, which everybody is quite familiar with, obviously some no votes that have been out there. But 10% of the companies fail to attain the support of at least 70%. But I think the next point is probably the most interesting, which is there's been a correlation. I don't know if they've done an R squared, but there's a correlation between the weak support for say and pay on one year and weak support for directors the following year. And this particularly, it might be the whole board, but it also might be specifically related to the comp committee. Director elections, there's still a majority, super majority, 96% of shareholder or directors rather that are getting support, but there's more and more directors that are falling below that 70%. This was a survey of 4,300 companies, so 1,100 directors basically out of those companies did not achieve the 70%. Share ownership, I'm sure everybody sees this, 68%. Our shares are owned by institutional investors, but they tend to vote more. The retail investors aren't really voting much, which is causing some differences. Director communications, I think the last point is probably the most interesting, which is 77% of directors, particularly in this Pulse survey, believe that communicating directly with shareholders on compensation is appropriate. And this is interesting, I think, and we're going to get into this point because we know the proposals that are out there in the area of compensation. We also know some of the rules have been passed as a result of Dodd-Frank. It's getting more complex. It's getting hard to put things into lines in the CD&A and explain. And if you've got some controversial proposals that you believe are appropriate for the company, it's difficult sometimes to get that across in the proxy. So obviously up for debate. I thought this was very interesting. You've seen probably, or a number of you that sit on these boards have seen the Vanguard letter and the BlackRock letter. It was really a knock on activism, but a support for long-term thinking and a long-term view was that shareholders and boards should be communicating and not just when there's a no vote or an issue. So this is something that's obviously created. Before that, it was the SDX proposal that was signed by a number of boards and a number of funds that basically said, look, here's some communication protocols that are potentially out there. The quote from Marty Lipton, everybody in the room probably knows Marty Lipton and knows how far to the right he's been relative to activism, but this was interesting because it shows a shift in paradigm. I'll read it real quickly. As activism moves in-house at major investors and the new paradigm becomes pervasive, the influence of the activist hedge funds and ISS and Glass Lewis will shrink and will be replaced by the policies, evaluations, and decisions of major investors. While this would be welcome relief from the short-termism imposed by activist hedge funds, it raises a new question. How will investors use this power? This remains to be seen. It's not likely that activism and short-termism will disappear totally, but I'm comfortable that the influence of major investors will be more favorable to shareholders generally and to the nation's economy than the self-seeking personal greed of hedge fund activists. So quote from Marty Lipton to start things out. Real quickly on the poll, this is about 50 people, a little short of 50 people responded to this. I think it's just interesting. 75% basically say that they're engaging at some level. There's still a number that basically say it's still minimal, but there's an ever-increasing number where it's more than in the past, and 11% in this room are actually dealing with activism. 30% as well, not just activism, 30% faced an activity, inquiry, challenge, and we know it can come in the form of a letter, it can come in the form of litigation. There's a whole continuum of factors. The other is, has your board or company discussed a change in board composition, skill sets? And we made this broader, than just activism, cyber, regulatory, et cetera. And the fact is, a number are, almost 50% are, but there's a number that aren't. And that doesn't mean they haven't changed the composition of their board. It just may not be as a reaction to the external influence. And then how would you classify your philosophy? Most say proactive. So I think this will be very interesting as we get into this debate and start the questions, okay? So let's start with you, Sarah. Okay, so Sarah's atoning for her sins. She basically has on the other side. Let me start here, and this is not a session, solely about activism, but I think this is kind of an interesting way to start. A lot of advice that we get as board members today is we need to bring the activist thinking into the boardroom. We need to have the black hats. We need to be able to understand where activists would be coming from. How do boards do that? How have you seen boards be effective in doing that?
I certainly don't know across the entire spectrum because a lot of boards do things and don't share the information. And one of the challenges we all have is trying to figure out what our peers do because there is much, much more coordination amongst active shareholders than there is amongst companies, which frankly hurts us on fronts like the regulatory front where we tend to be reactive every year to what's today's issue and instead of saying what do we want the world to look like. So it's a little hard to know, although a number of your companies are members of the Energy Governance Group, or we have phone calls a few times a year to compare notes on who's doing what, including whether or not our directors are meeting with shareholders, and if so, is it individually, is it only during proxy season, is it with a whole group so the director's an add-on, or is it actually a director meeting? You'll find if you ask companies if they engage, they almost all say yes, but if you drill down and ask them what they mean by that, it's across a wide spectrum, some of which I don't particularly consider engagement, at least if your measure is that you want to conduct it so that you're more apt to get the vote, even when you don't deserve it, because it's relatively easy to get the vote when you do. So I think there is a wide range, although it is certainly shifting, and what you saw with regard to proxy access this year was probably the biggest shift in company response to any issue that I've seen in 35 years of doing this. A huge shift and a significant change in the balance of power. The cost of acquiring an ability to seat and unseat directors is rapidly declining. And so it makes this issue much more interesting. I mean, I know that list really isn't quite on the table for this because this is more about, but I think as background it is worth saying there are economic reasons to think differently than you did before and how you answer that question.
Right. And I think, from a board perspective, a lot of times, the board itself takes contrary views, at least they should be, right? You've got individuals that are convinced last and ones that are convinced more easily. But I think bringing in that other side, one of the things I've talked about on one of my boards with the CEO is getting the sell side analyst view, because if all you're looking at is the good thing of the company, what's being presented in the boardroom, and you're not bringing that, what's bad about this idea, right? What's wrong with this idea? I think it sometimes makes it difficult to be able to understand where's the next thing going to happen, and obviously keeping up with what's happening in your industry, what's happening across the board. We were talking about this Bank of America with the chairman CEO role, just keeping in touch with what are the things that we have on our board that potentially can create, that we see in activists taking, or not even activists, institutional investors, governance activists taking issue with. So let's jump into, because I think this is fascinating in terms of the program that you've built, Sarah, at Apache. And your role, particularly your full-time focus on board shareholder interaction, facilitating one-on-ones between the Apache board and the Apache shareholders, it is unique. I think it's fairly unique. So can you tell us more about what you do?
Sure. In a nutshell, those of you who know our founder, or Apache's founder, Raymond Plank, I think he was one of the first to realize that as shareholders started to use the proxy vote, it would be the cheapest power in America, because you don't have to buy the shares if you know the shareholders. And we realized that our IR function was largely information out, and most of the information is lagging indicators may be overstated, but that most companies had a gap between that function, the things that proxy solicitors do, and the things that you would do if your life depended on knowing who your shareholders are, getting their support when you needed them. So it is my job to visit in person, individually, with at least our top 200 shareholders, as close to every year as possible. The meetings are usually 2 to 3 hours. I ask for 20 minutes. They end up keeping them longer. I also try to meet with not just the large shareholders, but I will say the shareholders who start the trouble, because they're the ones who start the trouble and the ones who engage in the trouble, and if no one's starting it, there's nothing to engage in. Try to meet with all of the small but influential shareholders that everyone watches to see if they are in your stock, to ask them why they are not. This is part of your comment before about bringing in a negative news. So we consciously look at who we want to be our shareholders, and we go meet with them too. Meet with every single activist shareholder that we can identify at least every year, often in a variety of settings, and the NGOs that are behind them. So it's kind of a range, and you do it geographically and keep moving. The director piece came in a couple years ago. It wasn't in Raymond's mind when I was hired necessarily that directors would be on the road, but when we had a bad say-on-pay vote 2 years ago. And we knew, because our shareholders tell us, that they hate it if companies send managers or the CEO to talk about the CEO's pay. They expect to hear from directors, especially on that issue. And so we took a number of our directors, but one in particular, the head of our comp committee, on the road. He personally met individually with over 50% of the shareholders representing over 50% of our shares over about a 6-month period. And we discovered in that, we learned a lot of things from that experience that I certainly didn't know. One of them, oddly, which we did not expect or plan, was that shareholders were regularly buying shares after they met with him. And we were not doing an IR department's job. We were not talking about managerial issues. But we realized there was such a dim view of the effectiveness of boards in general that when you take a rock star in as a board member, I had shareholders blurt out to me as if my director was not present, because they were all my friends, "Are all your directors this good?" Because again, they otherwise don't know. So that started a program where now I've just, because of your question, I went back and looked over half of our board members have had individual meetings with shareholders. It tends to be, now we have an independent chair. Independent chair was our lead director, head of the comp committee, head of the CG&N committee, but sometimes it's the director in the location of the city. So it's, our experience has been tremendous on fronts that we did not expect, but it started with say-on-pay, and we've now almost artificially found reasons to have directors on the road. It's easy in Europe because, in fact, they expect it. And if you have European shareholders and you don't have a director on the road, you are missing a huge opportunity. I mean, they notice when you're not there. So we definitely cover that piece of the shareholder base more. But then we try to get them on the schedule where shareholders assume if it's August, they will see us. so that it doesn't raise any questions about is your CEO in trouble or anything else. It's just, this is a normal part. So it didn't start as a director interaction job. It has morphed into that being a larger part of the job than it used to be.
That's fascinating. I want to get more into the why, what, when, where, how, because for those of you who've looked at the Blue Ribbon Commission report, which was issued by the NACD on this, they kind of focused it that way, and there's some great, I think, great guidance in there. We'll try to cover as many of those W questions and H questions as we can. But before we do that, Gentry, when you hear Sarah describe the program that she's built at Apache, what's your reaction to that, particularly what you're seeing from other companies that Baez is investing in and the type of who you're interacting with and the frequency and so forth?
I would say that program is fairly atypical from what we see in companies generally. More often the interactions that we have had with directors have been one-off, somewhat atypical, somewhat almost haphazard in the sense of it's usually when something's gone wrong or there's an issue.
There's a deep ending.
Exactly. And so, there's a problem and it has to be addressed, and it's a heightened sense of a concern or awareness at that point in time, whereas Sarah's program is much more proactive. That being said, the communications that we have had with boards or board members or with managements trying to understand what's going on in the board has risen greatly over the past 5 years, and it's continuing a trend that has been in place for probably the last 15 and started in the aftermath of the dot-com era when I think investors realized that there was obviously a lot that could go wrong, and if prices were going down and they needed some dividends, that there needed to be a change in the way that management teams and boards of directors paid attention to shareholder returns. And that started it. The concept of expensing of stock options became a hot issue for us and for others. And then all of that was amplified again by the financial crisis here 7 years ago. And so the concerns that are today are mostly maybe related to activism and these shareholders that are stirring up trouble in one form or another really have been, the foundation had been laid by a period of time that was just challenging for investors overall, and where they've now demanded better performance and really, top-notch corporate governance.
Yeah, and I think the thing that's interesting too, it's the really big case examples that get a lot of attention, right? And a lot of this feeds off of itself in terms of, and I think that's actually an interesting dynamic when you're in the middle of it. It's a good dynamic to be able to, again, internalize in the boardroom and understand where do you stand, right, in this spectrum. Sarah, I want to go back to something. A number of us who have been in oil and gas for a long time know of Raymond Plank, right? And some of the kind of the way Raymond is and the culture. Can you go into sort of, as you built this program, you said you had a no vote, so you had a reason, right? You had a catalyst. But what were some of the obstacles? And I want you particularly to talk about with the board, right? You're going to be engaging in these one-on-ones. You've now engaged at least half the board. What are some of the things that you heard, at least when you're initially starting, and how does that maybe compare to where you are today with the board?
Certainly at the beginning, one of the concerns was that because it is so atypical for directors to talk to shareholders outside of a crisis, that you might be sending the signal that you don't have confidence in your CEO. We didn't have that problem the first year because we had a failed say-on-pay vote, and it was when I would say I want the head of our comp committee to come and talk to you about pay because Steve cannot. So, but that is in fact a concern. It's one of the reasons we start in Europe and build up, because there's no implication to something odd going on when you first do it. So you definitely have to be, and the board was concerned about, what message are we signaling? There's clearly, you can't raise this subject without someone saying FD in the first paragraph. And I'm very weary of FD discussions, but they do get raised. What if our directors reveal material non-public information? Part of me says, really? I was just reading about the Danish king Canute, who conquered Norway, Sweden, England, and had Denmark while he was a teenager. and we can't send a director and say, you will stick to this part of the sandbox. Much easier to handle than I think is suggested, especially because directors tend to be relatively talented people. Most governance issues are not material. And in fact, I think the FD concern reflects a basic, at least in my opinion, misperception about the main value of these meetings, which is not information out. It's information in. And you don't have a Reg D FD problem if someone is talking to you. And in fact, if you want a director to go into a meeting such that when they come out, they like us better, they respect us more, they believe in our leadership, you're going to do that by going in and saying, so help me understand, why did you buy the stock? What will cause you to buy more? Who else do you have in our peers that you think does better? If you weren't looking at the financials and you had to buy and sell, what would you look at? Do you ever look at any of those things because of us? It's the highest and the most effective and the most subtle form of complimenting is to ask questions. And we certainly talk to directors a lot about your information in. And what we've found is that it is astonishing what shareholders think that never crossed your mind and what they will tell you if you give them enough time, but they never tell you the good stuff in the first 45 minutes. So if it's a deck in 45 minutes and you're gone, you won't get that. But there was definitely a Reg D concern, certainly a concern about should we have a policy. The first time we were asked for one of these meetings, which was actually prior to Say on Pay, it was one of our UK shareholders. The board had that debate. Do we need to have a policy? We said, well, we're 60 years old as a company. This is the first time in 60 years a shareholder's asked for a phone call on a governance issue. We can probably handle the phone call without a policy and then figure out this is going to happen all the time, in which case we'll have to triage. And we did that for a time, and we just this year adopted a policy that essentially has what all you would expect the policy to have, the sign-off of the relevant people. But there was a little bit of concern about that, but I think that's an easily solved problem, and you can always, in any case-by-case, say, can't happen, not available, have someone else. But we had a lot of barriers, concerns about FD, concerns about whether you have a policy, concerns about training the directors. Again, I don't think it's that hard. I mean, you just go through exercises where you say to the director, okay, the shareholder asks you, we had a death in Egypt this year. What do you say? And the director knows to say, you're asking about our safety policies. We oversee this. I mean, it's a director level thing. It's not hard to manage that, especially if there are two of you in the room, and if you do it enough, I found it helps to be a team for a long time. So we take turns, and sometimes my heel comes down in their instep. And if I'm sitting and I pick up a pen, it means I'll take that one. If it's something where the wording, even on the big picture level, has to be significant. But really, it's much more about information in. And if the focus is that, and in fact, most of our shareholders, we meet with us when I ask, what do you hate about companies sending directors to see you? The first answer is they are too arrogant. They talk down to us. They talk too much. They interrupt and so forth. So if you kind of switch the focus to what can I take in that will be good business information on a big picture level, you can get past that obstacle. We haven't had any others. It's worked really well. It's just really now we're at the point of being creative about, okay, we don't have any particular governance issues, but we have found value from this. How do we finesse the right amount of interaction?
Yeah. Well, I want to come back to the skill sets too, because I think as I'm sitting here listening, of course, Reg FD, we want to come back to that because that is a big issue. I mean, I sit here as a board member saying, you don't want to violate Reg FD. You do want to be able to go in prepared. You do want to have, I was talking to James Flagg before this, so I serve on the board of HCC. We were talking about one voice. You want to have one voice, and it takes a lot of training as a board, a lot of communication, a lot of conversation, and I think policies, going through the ability to have a policy and understand what's on, what's off. Sometimes it's easier to talk about what are the things that are off topic, what are we not going to engage in, than necessarily what are the slate of things that we want to engage in. So I'm going to turn it to you, Gentry, because you've got Sarah coming to meet with you, right? And let's say other companies have taken suit and have similar programs. What do you want to talk to them about?
Well, I think, as in a position like our firm would be in, we have a regular dialogue probably already going with the management team. And so our analysts and our investment staff are already covering the company and trying to understand its business operations, trying to understand its positioning, the things that we would really care about talking to the board about. And some of these you get a color from talking to management, but they will abjure comments sometimes about capital allocation. So that's probably, from our firm's perspective, the number one thing that we like to have an understanding of how the board views its responsibilities for capital allocation. So what is the dividend policy? How committed are the directors to maintaining the dividend policy? What are the factors that are in the back of their mind as they're meeting to talk about what they do with the company's cash flow? And obviously management has their views, but our view is that the board clearly is the ultimate say on these kinds of decisions, and we like to have an understanding that the board is really holding the management team accountable for doing a great job on capital allocation, and that stems from the fact that we invest for a long period of time. So we may buy the greatest business in the world, but if they're not doing a good job of reinvesting their cash flow over the period of time that we're shareholders, then we're never going to achieve the rate of return that we've hoped to going in. And like I said, so that would involve dividends, that would involve stock buybacks, that would involve, capital spending, that would involve merger and acquisition activity, and then I think compensation is the other issue that comes up. We are not an activist investor in the scheme of things. I think most companies would look at us and say that we have a fairly management-friendly profile, and that's typically because we like to get into what we consider to be great businesses and own them for the long run, and so it's somewhat atypical for us to be getting involved in a situation where there are problems and things that need to be fixed. And so as a result, we tend to buy things where we think the management is in great shape, the board is operating well, and so we're probably not the troublemaker, as Sarah referred to earlier. But that being said, there have been instances where compensation seems overly generous, and where conversations with boards or members of the board have been important. And I'd say we haven't talked about proxy advisory firms. The proxy advisory firms are much more aggressive today in recommending votes against directors or against compensation plans. And so understanding, making sure you have all the facts to make decisions is really important. And like Sarah said, it's hard for the management maybe to come in and talk about all the dynamics associated with that, but somebody on the board might have a better perspective. So those are the two areas, compensation and capital allocation, where we as a firm really have appreciated having a wider perspective.
Right, and I think, compensation as well, it's difficult, and you said this, Sarah, for the CEO necessarily to talk about their own compensation or IR to be sent to talk about compensation. But, one of the dynamics that I'm seeing too is by, obviously by the power shifting, by more influence of shareholders, by more questions, by say on pay, is the debates within the boardroom actually getting richer relative to, not in terms of monetary dollars, what I meant was the dialogue really getting richer in terms of, what's our philosophy and where are we right now on pay? Where do we want to get to? How can we do it? What's the rationale? How does it fit with our strategy, right? We've got strategy for the company. How does it help us get there? How does it help us achieve where we are with, where we want to be with talent, right? In retaining our talent, motivating our talent. So I think those are key things that dialogue ought to be going on anyway. The issue is whether you and how much, right, you share. But I think the complexity complexities that are being introduced into the disclosures are now making it more and more necessary, obviously, to have that dialogue and possibly, again, no one size fits all, but possibly to discuss outside. I want to get a little bit into skill sets because I think it's, again, fascinating. You said 50% of Apache board has met. So some of that, I assume, is, role specific, lead director, chairman, head of comp, maybe Occasionally, people still want to talk to the audit committee, although that used to be where exactly they wanted to focus. But when you look at the skill sets that are necessary, listening skills, okay, the ability to be able to have this one voice, right, think quickly. Obviously, you would think most directors, right, should have that. But what do you see in terms of the training you might need to do, or the profile you're looking for those that you want to communicate with shareholders?
I think there are more boards, including ours, who look at the skill set of, would you be someone we could use to interact with shareholders, which, you know, you can have a board of very talented people, but if they're all angry introverts, you know, you're missing a useful piece. We also look at diversity in terms of which directors can speak to which shareholders, because people work differently with different shareholders. We also look at, in fact, we're looking at our skills matrix right now to look at directors with the skill sets that diminish our vulnerability that we can then convey. As most of you know, the focus of a lot of the supporters of proxy access is that if not next year, then the following year, they will run directors with environmental expertise against extractive industry company boards. And so we look at that, it's a vulnerability as well as an opportunity for us. In fact, we're looking not just at the matrix, but at redoing our board bios so that we know which constituency is reading which piece, whereas it used to be you would look at bios with the filter of, we want to show we love all of our directors equally. And now we look more at all the different constituencies. So I think there is a shift in skill set and the training. I mean, although many directors can be good at the interactions if that training happens. I think too many are not, because at least my analysis is you have the corporate pyramid and directors are at the very top. Shareholders perceive themselves as being one notch above that. And if you are used to people talking to you the way information comes up, you forget how to have the conversation when you're going what our shareholders perceive to be up one more notch. And there are a lot of directors who don't do that well. I always track things like the interruptions, having the first half of your question have a compliment embedded in it. That's an interesting question. Let me see if this, and then say, did that address what you wanted? So there's a training gap, but I have heard, I know my colleagues at other companies have been talking about candidates who, whether they have the communication experience or they have the director contacts. I mean, there's some that come trailing clouds of glory. I never thought I'd quote Wordsworth in a governance conversation, but that gives you, an extra opportunity, foot in the door.
You know, we talked in advanced entry about whether nom and gov committees were approaching you about potential candidates, given what Sarah said, which is there's more skills that are really being sought after, some of these communication skills and so forth. But how often are you really looking, as an investor, how often are you looking at the composition, the board composition, and looking for diversity in skill sets? Or is it more, you've got a number of CEOs, former CEOs, you've got industry expertise? How do you kind of look at that from an investor perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing that I'd say is it could be an important factor, but when we look at investing in a company, there are a whole lot of factors that probably we have got to check off the box before we come to the board. And I'd say the board really only comes up if it's perceived to be a problem. And so that being said, what would you like to see? I think you'd like to see strong experience of a number of different forms. I mean, in terms of executives, industry experts, functional experts, those types of things. Certainly, outside independent board members that can contribute good perspective, as well as probably key executives from the company. And I would say a board that has the benefit of time, and at least having some members that have been there and seen things happen over a period of time, because all of these businesses go through cycles and ups and downs, and so having the benefit of experience and time certainly helps too. But it's attention to the board really comes when there's a problem or a concern. And so it's, I guess, the other positive about looking over time at these companies is that the people that have succeeded in staying out of the headlines for a long period of time tend to make you think that they've got better practices in that regard.
Yeah, and when I look at, and obviously it's a very unique debate relative to board composition on the board with nom and gov committees. I mean, my experience has been that lately a lot of these external forces are causing, in addition to, obviously the functional expertise and industry expertise in all things, is specialists, right? And we talked about one of the external forces. This is certainly not a session on cyber. We'll have another one of those, but is really, do you put the specific expertise on the board? Here we're talking with shareholder communication, some general skills, but do you put the specific expertise on the board, or do you capitalize on the experts that are out there? And that's always a debate. But I think the board composition is shifting too. I think one of the outcomes potentially of the shareholder activism and the influence that's out there is the ability to want to serve on a board. And I think that's, it would be interesting to take, I think, a look at how that has in itself changed composition. And it could be after one of these long series activist campaigns that many have said, look, this just is too tough, right? We'll do something else. I want to go back because I know a number of questions that came in through the Pulse were about FD. And we talked a little bit about Reg FD, but I think, as a director going in front of shareholders, as management going in front of shareholders, this is something where an awareness is key. And I think, Sarah, you talked about, a lot of these things you're listening. They're saying, you're asking them questions about their ownership, and you're listening to what they have to say about the company, what it views of the company. But can you talk a little bit more about your view of things that are off limits, and where would that line kind of be crossed, and how do you avoid that line being crossed in advance of the discussion? Do you send out, here's the topics we're going to discuss, or is it just a general awareness that we're staying away from these issues that might create FT concerns?
It is a great question, as much as I made fun of it earlier, because it's very easy to understand in general. It's very hard when there are 2 or 3 of you, if there's a director in the room, and you're getting pressed on a question. Some of it is certainly practice and training, because of course an investor is going to be smart and try to push to get whatever they want out of you. So part of the training that we have for directors is to, when they hear a question, to think that the first thing out of their mouth is going to be another question. Help me understand where that comes from. What is the concern behind it? So again, that's complimenting. It's surprising what you get out of it. Mm-hmm. It also gives you time to think about what is the board level comment that you can provide, because often that extra detail then allows you to say, well, the way the board looks at that is this. So if it's kind of like you train your kids for the first thing that comes out of their mouth when they're in a situation with their colleagues and they need to say no to something. You need that bag of tricks to be able to say, okay, the question comes in, and if it's not about board composition or compensation, be ready with the question first. Obviously, if there are a couple of us in the room, it gets, it's easier to take turns. Most management level questions, it's pretty easy to figure out that that's what it is. And at least we don't like to say, that's a management question. We won't talk about it. It just sounds a little bit door closing when you can say, it's valuable for us to hear that you are concerned about that, and I will make sure it is conveyed. I don't think any of our board members have trouble if they are responding to something to saying, I will take that back to the board, and if there's a board level response, we will get back to you. And that's a relatively easy thing to say, and sometimes that's the right thing. Sometimes it's the perfectly right thing to say, beats me. I've said that a whole lot of times. I've said, I don't even know what the vocabulary words mean that you just said, so try again on my level. I mean, it's also something most companies don't do, and it doesn't hurt to be friendly. I mean, I figure shareholders know how to give us the vote. They know how to buy more of our shares if they want to. I want them to want to. So have a couple tricks in the back of your mind is useful to answer questions with questions, to know that the fact that you were asked doesn't mean you have to answer. It does open the door to a lot of information gathering. What else do other people ask you? One of the things I like to do is say, How do other companies answer that? What is the best answer you've ever heard? If I want to get their vote, I will ask them, what would be the answer that would get your vote? I mean, you can say it in a couple ways. You can ask what the best, but sometimes they will tell you, this set of facts is what will give you a waiver from the staggered board proposal, and then you know how to go from there. So I think it's pretty handleable with some training and with at least one person in the room, ideally not from the legal department, because that conveys the wrong message, who's with the director.
Right. We have a couple questions coming in. Before we get to these questions, let me ask one thing, and I think social media has certainly been one of those topics that boards aren't necessarily that comfortable with. It depends, right? But from a business context, but you see it more and more. Obviously, we're seeing a lot with certain candidates, but you talk a lot, Sarah, about one-on-ones, right? Roadshows, face-to-face. What about social media? And I'm really going to ask both of you this in terms of the interaction, the dynamic, not just putting things out on your website that are questions, question and answer, but that interaction. Do you use social media? Does Steve tweet?
Not much. I mean, certainly we use a variety of forms of interaction if we've already established the relationship in person, because as you know, if you've met someone, every phone call after that is very different than if you've not had the in-person meeting before. And we think there's a lot of room for misinterpretation of things as well as a written record with a lot of use of social media. So we try to focus more on basic information on the website, so if someone wants to find something without having to talk to us, it's there and it's easy to find. I think on the social media side, it's probably not thought of that way, but moving to an online proxy is going to be very important, because if you were voting 14,000 proxies in 6 weeks, you want to pull the proxy up online. You want to hit director comp, executive comp, and you want to hit the one thing and have that paragraph pop up, and you want the plain English description that would otherwise be illegal, except that you can click on every term and get the qualifiers. And most of our proxy voters are in their 20s and 30s. 85% of our proxy voters are women. That is what they are used to. If you have an urge to do social media to feel cool, do that. I mean, it definitely makes a big difference to being readable and understandable. So do we use some? Yes. Would I recommend it in place of in-person? Absolutely not. In fact, I can back that up with our main story of this year, which is we had ISS recommend against our pay in the worst possible language. They called our pay plan pay for failure. They said it was atypical. Those were the nicest things they said.
Very strong, yes.
Fairly strong. It was all about the pay of our now former CEO, not our current CEO. But it was ISS, and it was very strong language. And one of our directors, who luckily already knew most of our shareholders, and I, called them no use of proxy solicitors. We're 81% institutionally held. We got 81% of the vote. And the only votes we did not get of our top 100 shareholders were the ones we didn't have a pre-existing relationship. It had nothing to do with what company, what country, whether they were a mutual fund or something else. Every single vote we didn't get in that top tier was one where we didn't have a pre-existing relationship. And it was an in-person one.
Well, it's certainly a great commercial for why, right? Fantastic, the results. I'm going to shift a little bit and get to some of the questions. Obviously, we've got them coming up, and please feel free to send more.
Plead the fifth.
The Bank of America debate about the chairman and CEO, and do you separate? And obviously, there's reasons behind that. What's your perspective of that situation?
You know, this is one of the examples of what the proxy advisory firms have gotten very focused on here lately in terms of generally, they will come out in favor of separating the chairman and the CEO roles. And as we look at it as a firm, those proxy advisory firms typically are looking to adopt some kind of formulaic type opinion on issues. So whether you separate those roles, how many boards should a board member be on, because if they're on too many as they define it, they'll vote against you. Right. How many board meetings do you have to miss before they'll vote against you? How big can the compensation plan be? before they'll vote against it, and it's a formulaic type approach. And so I guess as a firm, we tried, we listen to that, we listen to the management team's opinion on it, or the board's opinion on it, and then we try to sit back and make an educated, long-term decision on, do we think this is in the interest of shareholders or not? And it's really on a case-by-case basis at that point. It's not necessarily a formula, but in this situation, what makes sense to us? And so there have been times in which separating those roles has been important. There are other times when the traditions and the cultures of the company really argue for keeping those roles together, and where there isn't a problem, I guess sometimes there doesn't need to be a solution to it. So,
Right.
So in this case, I'm not as familiar. Particularly, we have held Bank of America in times past. We're not a shareholder at the moment, but it's. I would say that we look at those things on a case-by-case basis, and we try to only solve a problem. Solve a problem if there really is a problem. That's the way we look at it.
How breathtakingly common sense.
Yeah, absolutely common sense. And I think on that, obviously that debate, there'd probably be many opinions in the room, but I've seen it work both ways, right? And obviously if you've got a combined role, you've got a very effective lead director, and you've given that lead director power, right, within the rules to be able to be effective in that, especially when you have, chairman, CEO is the same person, but both can be effective. Obviously, there's a lot more tied up in that situation. But so I think this is really for all of us, but it's kind of a multi-question here. Do directors ever meet with investors without management, by design or accident? Sarah, I'm going to just start with you on that one. I raise my eyebrows a lot in that, but what are you seeing, or what's your view on that?
We've done it 2 or 3 times total in the 9 years I'm there. Never by design, usually when we're on the road and there are more shareholders in the city than we can cover. And if there's a shareholder where I know them really, really well, and I've got a director who's very good at doing this, we will divide and conquer. I don't like to, because we don't have a witness in the room for what was said and wasn't said, which is why it's been 2 or 3 times when, and it's usually when the person the director is meeting with is a pure proxy voter, not a PM or an analyst, because the proxy voters don't ask you management questions. So it's safer from that point of view. So 2 or 3 times, but we don't look to, it's my job to meet one-on-one, but I feel vulnerable in every meeting because I certainly don't record them, but how can I prove I didn't say something? Hasn't been an issue, but so 2 or 3 times.
Yeah, I would certainly be nervous about
Very,
that in terms
but
for all the
very
reasons
carefully
you mentioned.
selected, exactly.
Very, very careful. And I guess for all of us, have you had investors call directors directly without management involved, and then how do you handle? My view on that is, and all kind of common sense says that you coordinated with management, you talked about your messaging, you understand, whether you have a formal written protocol or policy, you certainly understand what that means. But that would be a difficult one. But how do you feel, Gentry, about that? If you had a director call you with no management involved, just off the blue, how would you?
Or do you call them ever?
Yeah.
Fess up.
Right. Inside track, maybe.
Yeah, no, that is not something that happens in the scheme of things. I guess Houston, Texas happens to be, the second. There are basically more big companies headquartered here than anywhere else except for New York.
Right.
And so whether you call them or not, there is the chances that you just run into each other in some forum. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a pre-arranged or thought-out thing where you might have a conversation. And there are times, doing our job, you're always looking for insights. You're not looking for material, non-public information, but you're always trying to understand a business and its positioning and the thought process that is underlying it. And so, you know, if the opportunity is there to have a discussion with somebody who's an educated, informed, you know, member of the organization, I mean, it's something that, you know, you can benefit from. So I think that being said, you have to be very careful, and it's not something that we have a, you know, targeted sort of idea that we're out doing, but it's, you know, it's, and it has, I guess we have had outreach from board members directly, and it has typically been in very unusual situations where there is a faction on the board that is not happy with the way things are going.
Right.
So it has happened. It's very rare.
Sarah, what's your view on that?
We try to highlight how uncomfortable jail is. I mean, obviously, you can't know what communications have occurred where the director hasn't told you, but certainly our board is quite aware of the risks and the importance of not letting that happen, or reporting it when it does. So we're highly alert. I'm not aware that there's much of an effort to reach our directors.
Right.
And probably the closest we have is that we do try to feature some of our directors as speakers at various forums. We had the head of our governance committee at the International Corporate Governance Network in June, which is kind of global proxy voters. It's 5,000 people you want to influence. So we were the only, I think, U.S. company with a director there speaking. So of course people would come up in the breaks to say things, but I was standing there the whole time, and you know, so certainly that's one where it's you don't know necessarily what they're going to say, but that was a risk we could take.
Right. Okay, this one is for me, and I think it's on the outside influence and the change in the board composition as a result. It says, in consideration of increased compliance requirements in a number of industries like pipelines, obviously serving on the board of one, and high-profile nature of safety incidents, debates, and media attention, how has your role on your boards changed? And I think that's a great question. Obviously, you know, having a committee when you have high industries where safety is critical, obviously safety incidents can be incredibly debilitating to a number of factors. The board obviously employs other, you know, they can be horrible, right, for the company. Having committee, I know in the Buckeye board we have an HSSE committee that's very focused, that looks at the trends, that's doing more than tabletop. I mean, they're out there with board members looking at, you know, what are we going to do if this type of incident occurs, continuing the dialogue, looking at peers, and understanding, you know, what's going on in them. Do we have those same type of circumstances? But I think having a focused committee on that really puts attention to it. Obviously, keeping the full board informed when you do your enterprise risk management, and that's a key risk to the company. You obviously want to engage the full board in that discussion. In terms of, you know, what would we do? How are we covered? Incident response, and this is something too. As I was thinking about, you know, the cyber question, and we had a board meeting yesterday where we were talking about, actually at the NACD board, we were talking about and had a session on cyber. It's really the incident response. You know you're going to get hacked. You know you're going to have something occur when you're in these industries where things do happen. But how will you respond? Are you prepared to respond? How will you communicate about that? Who's on point so you don't waste any time relative to the response? So let me ask you, both of you, the question, if you think of if you think of words that describe great interaction between a board and shareholders, what words would you use to describe great? Maybe just a couple words, one or two.
Go ahead. I have an entire list. So.
Oh, good. Well, I was going to say consistent would be one word for me. I mean, in terms of whatever you're going to do, be consistent about it. Because if you're not, then it probably raises concern in other people's opinion. And I think being honest and clear and forthright those are, I mean, clearly how you'd want to communicate with people in any sense of the word.
Mine's more of a to-do list than words, or a to-don't list, depending on your point of view, which is if you want to have a director shareholder meeting in such a way that you're more apt to get whatever the support is you want because of that meeting, don't take an army of people. The closest you can get to 2 people, the better. Don't take a deck absent a proxy fight. All of our shareholders will say, thank you for not bringing a deck. Don't interrupt. Don't talk for more than 50% of the time and have someone else measure you, because you will underestimate how much you talk. Compliment, compliment, compliment. Ask the shareholders for all of their concerns before you address the first one, because we have found if we ask what they don't like about us and they tell us one thing and you say, well, here's how we can address that, in some ways it shuts them down. You need to say, and what else bothers you? What else could we do better? So ask for all the concerns before you address any of them. Be interesting. It doesn't matter whether you talk about the company or not, but you need to have the meeting in such a way that they will want to meet again with you next year. So I try to think about what it is that they will find interesting as a human being and what they will find interesting as a professional. End the meeting in a way that you are liked, because they can buy more shares. They can vote for you if they want to. They know who their proxy committee is. They know how to buy. So you want to get them to want to. And I think most of the focus is on information, not will they like you. Demonstrate leadership, which is to me the number one forward-looking indicator. I don't care whether my directors mention the word Apache. If when we walk out of the room, the shareholder says, I have faith in that company because that kind of person is on the board. And a lot of our shareholders tell us the best IR departments showcase their CEOs in a way that's not about information, it's about leadership. Consider the culture. There's a very different way of interacting with different shareholders depending on what type they are. And then don't forget the thank you notes and calls in between. If you think about it, our shareholders buy and they sell anonymously. Do we ever call and say, I do, but I always say, you sold. You hurt my feelings. I actually do this all the time. And now I have a lot of shareholders who call and say, you know what, sometimes we may have to rebalance in the next quarter because they know I'm going to, but you think on average they're a little more apt to buy more if they know that someone actually cares and notices and says, what does this mean? What do we need to take back? How did we fail you? So things that work in your personal world work in the adult world, especially the shareholder director world. That's my list.
That's a great list, and I think I'm picking up too. That's a great competitive advantage, right, that you've created, particularly that interaction. And although it started at a time in which you had an issue to deal with, you've certainly turned it into something that has consistency and clarity, and they know to expect it. So, and I would say probably my words would be prepared. You've got to be prepared. You don't go into it, with half of anything, but it's well prepared, it's well discussed with management, and there's no one size fits all, and there's so many factors that really influence your board shareholder communication, the situation you're in, composition of the board, how you feel comfortable with management, what are shareholders asking you about, who do they want to talk to? I mean, all those things, there's a laundry list, but basically all impact. So I'm going to leave us, since we are in Houston, Texas, I'm going to leave 2 questions. One's for you, Sarah, and one's for you, Jenny. Sarah, price of oil in 6 months. She knew it was coming, so she had
beats me.
Beats you. Okay, that's probably good. That's as good of a crystal ball as we're going to get. And Gentry, for you, you probably can anticipate. What's the stock market going to be in 6 months?
Well, I'm going to quote my boss, Fayez, and tell you that nervous energy is a great destroyer of wealth. So you shouldn't care what happens in the next 6 months. We have faith in corporate America growing its profits over time and hope that stock prices will follow. So,
great advice, great advice. Before we leave the stage, I just want to mention there is a plethora of information on this topic. And in your packets, you'll have key takeaways. Also on the NACD online site, when you go to events, you can click on that and you can get the key takeaways, you can get all the materials, the Blue Ribbon Commission report, all the things you'd want to read. So please take the opportunity to take advantage of that. And thank you very much for being an engaging audience.